Hello, and welcome to uPhilosopher. Today, I want to talk some more about education, as we just had a pretty big argument, right, in the Senate and amongst the population in general. There was a lot of protesting and untold numbers of people writing and calling in to senators about the Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos. And so there was a fair amount of name calling on both sides. And some of the argument hinges on this idea of school choice and also on the idea of teachers' unions. And I think both of those are really worth talking about and probably need their own conversation. What I wanted to start with was I was particularly interested to find out that during the argument about her nomination, certain groups decided to go ahead and put some advertisements out in support of Miss DeVos, perhaps in some way to try and sway public opinion, even though it's technically not the public that would vote for her, but perhaps they were concerned that the people who were contacting the senators might in some way influence the senators, and perhaps Miss DeVos would not necessarily be appointed. So what was of interest in those ads is one of them stated the following. Why is the radical left so full of rage and hate? They still can't accept that Trump won and they lost. Now, extreme liberals like Elizabeth Warren are trying to stop Betsy DeVos from becoming Secretary of Education. DeVos angers the extreme left because she exposes their hypocrisy. DeVos wants low-income kids to have the same choices that liberal elitists have for their families. DeVos wants equal opportunity in education for all kids, and that makes angry liberals even angrier. And I just thought that was fascinating, because it certainly does seem to deny this idea that we generally have that liberals are the bleeding hearts, right? So I remember not so long ago, we used to make fun of Democrats and liberals for being the ones, oh, you're always trying to give money to people and you care about the poor and oh, you just don't really care about capitalism and you just, oh, the poor animals and so on and so forth. And so now it seems that I guess we're maybe perhaps to some degree moving in the other direction, at least when it's convenient, insofar as, okay, well now these liberals are full of rage and hate, and specifically that they're anti kind of poor children in a sense, that they do not want low-income children to have the same chances as other children, the same opportunities. And so specifically, right, what's of interest to me here is this idea of DeVos wants equal opportunity and education for all kids, right? And so I want to put, first of all, just a pin in the idea that, this makes liberals angry, because I think that's worth touching on briefly. But what I want to start with is the idea of kind of equal educational opportunity. And that just sounds like a pretty fantastic idea. I mean, it's certainly one that I'm a fan of. The idea that every student, right, has real opportunities for just as much education and just as strong education, right? Just, teachers that are as excellent, right, and to textbooks and to educational technologies and to safe places to learn. Just to name a few things that you would think, well, we want all students to have. And so, so what's the issue? Well, part of what the issue is at hand here is this idea of, well, Ms. DeVos is in favor of waivers. At least let's assume what is being referenced here. The idea that schools are in essence in competition with each other, especially you have the public school system, but then you have a privatized school system where parents can decide, oh, I don't want to send my child to this failing public school. Instead, I'm going to send them to this excellent private school or this excellent charter school or something like that. The argument seems, if we're going to be legitimate about it and be fair, it's either a matter of we make sure that every school is absolutely fantastic. That way, no matter where a child is, even if they're required to go to that school, that we know that they're going to get the best possible education at that school. Or we do something like some sort of set of vouchers where the schools are in competition, but every child has the opportunity to go to any school. So we're not going to make sure that every school is great. We're going to let them kind of compete against each other. And the parents get to decide, well, what really counts as a great school, and they'll bring the money there. Well, if what we're talking about is equal educational opportunity then, and these low income and poor students, then if we're going to actually do this, and as teachers, I think we basically need a list of demands. We're going to say, no, 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 no. Making every school awesome, not a great idea. That's just not going to work. Okay, fine. You want competition. Parents want school choice. Great. Well then, very simply, you need a set of things if it's actually going to be equal. It can't just be, okay, we pay part of the tuition for these other better schools. It can't be something along the lines of, we pick a few token students from the bad, supposedly, schools that can then get vouchers to go to the supposedly better schools. Equality, right, would then instead suggest that we need a series of things for these students who are underprivileged, for these students like that, and think about it, it's not their fault, in other words. It's not their fault that they're born to a poor family. Their family is probably working very, very hard, right? So if they deserve an equal opportunity, then, and that means that they can go to any school, we need, number one, full tuition, period, to any school. Does not matter how expensive that school is if that school is the best school, then that school, at least as that kind of argument is going, is the one that should be getting the money, and thusly, children should not be prevented from getting in if we're being equal about it. Whatever the cost is, that cost is paid. It is either waived or paid. There's a voucher for it, etc. Okay, so if we want equality, we know, in fact, that we need that. We know that we need an amazing busing system, because people who have low income probably don't have the ability to drop their children off in a school that is across the county because it's the best possible school when they're also working their jobs 7 days a week, you know, from 6 o'clock to 8 o'clock at night or whatever. So we need an amazing bus system so that we can make sure that that child can get probably beyond districts, but kind of go wherever is best for them in the county. So full tuition to wherever they need to go. Absolutely fantastic busing to wherever it is that they need to go. And then we have to start thinking about some other things that make it a bit more complex. We need to make sure that the students have access fully to the textbooks and to the educational technologies, right? In other words, the students who are going to those schools, if those schools are providing materials for them or requiring that they bring their own materials. In other words, we need to make sure that these children have as much access to the educational technologies that enable some students to succeed in the schools as the other students. We need to start thinking about things like, well, if they're taking long buses or if their parents don't have much money to be able to compete with these other students, if the whole idea is about competition, well, we need to make sure that these children have breakfast and lunch, and if they're having to stay longer for some reason, there's some sort of aftercare program or something like that because their parents are working all day and need to come pick them up, or it's a long distance to be able to pick them up, some sort of dinner as well. Because children, of course, who are underfed or malnourished, right, they're not going to perform as well. They're not going to be able to learn as much. I mean, who really cares about English, right? Who cares about verb conjugations when they're hungry? Not many people. So we need to make sure that the children have full tuition, that they have busing, that they have equal access to the educational technologies that are used and useful in the school, textbooks, so on and so forth. We need to make sure that they're fed and that they're well fed. And then we need to start thinking even a little bit further along the lines of, okay, well, wait a minute. Some of these children, especially by the time they're in high school, are having to support their families. They're having to go work additional jobs. And we go, good for them, right? Well, the problem is again, this affects their educational opportunities. Can they do after-school clubs? Can they participate in athletics? Can they go to events for a National Junior Honor Society, so on and so forth? They're not going to do as well, most likely, if they're also working a part-time job after school in order to help support their families. So a fair number of these children probably would need a stipend of some sort, at least by the time they're in high school, to be able to help support themselves and their families instead of having to go to work so that they can focus completely on their schooling. So we need the funding for full tuition to any school necessary, a complete, fantastic busing system, equal access and provisions for educational technologies. We need them to be well fed and to provide the food for them. And we need to make sure that they probably have a stipend so that they don't have to work, so that they can have the same chance as all of the other children who don't have to work and and can focus on their studies. And of course, there's one thing, and I think this would be a real sticking point. I think if we're really, really honest with ourselves, one of the reasons why private schools and some of these other private charter schools and so on and so forth supposedly do better, at least in terms of standardized test scores, which again is a whole nother issue that we should probably talk about. Part of the reason why they do better is studies show that when you come from a higher socioeconomic status, you tend to do better on these kinds of tests anyways, right? There's a pretty large achievement gap between poor students and rich students. And of course, it's not a matter of better than or a matter of smarter than. It's a matter of the rich students have most likely had parents who had more time in many cases to spend more time, say, reading to them whilst they were very young. So students with money, in other words, are exposed to many, 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 many more words before they even get to school. But there's also the issue of wealthy parents can do things like afford private tutors for their children if they need it. They're able to provide their children with more like educational toys. They're more likely to have access to educational media. So long story short, you have a fairly large divide there where children coming from a lower socioeconomic status, or also if they're living in some sort of poverty that also involves danger and violence, they are students who drag the scores of the school down because they're the ones that learned the least amount at home because their families are busy working and struggling to survive. So with that in mind, again, that's not those children's fault. They're, in many cases, if not most, their parents are busting their butts to provide everything that they need for them, and they don't have enough money and time to make sure that the children are also getting educated at home and exposed to as many books, and they may not even have the money to buy books for their children. So all of that being said, we can't have a merit-based system either. In other words, my intuition is that if we're rewarding schools and punishing schools and attracting people by school grades, a lot of schools are going to say, oh, sure, Nick, you can do all of that. We'll let the students in, we'll, waive their tuition, we'll even make sure that they're bused and so on and so forth. But then what we kind of secretly do is we give them a test for admission. Because obviously, we have to choose which students can come in. And we don't want to do it first serve, right? Or based on need, like which students would really benefit the most from being at our school, which probably would be the lower socioeconomic students, the ones really in the need of the small class sizes and the really invested educators who have a lot of education and experience and so on and so forth. So we give them a test, and that keeps them out of the school, doesn't it? That way they don't affect our test scores. We give them some sort of merit test to see, and then we say, but see, we're a really elite school, and unfortunately your child just isn't an elite. So we have to get rid of that too. Unless we want to say that some children are just more deserving of education than others because of test scores. And as those test scores are generally just used as a means by which to eliminate people of different races or lower socioeconomic status, it's obviously not going to fit into this idea of equal opportunity. And the idea of equal opportunity is what it really comes down to. Then we don't need test scores, and that may even end up being the case in college, to decide whether or not the children should actually have a chance to go. And that, in fact, by the way, is why we started using the SAT to determine whether or not children could get into college or whether or not students could get into college. The SAT wasn't always required. It actually comes into being as a means by which to decide who's allowed into college, interestingly, during desegregation. So there's all these colleges that don't want to let black students in, and many of them genuinely thought that the best way to keep them out if you're not allowed to discriminate by race was to try to use a test that would reduce the numbers who were able to get in because they're not scoring as highly on these tests. And then you can say, well, see, it had nothing to do with race. We're just picking the best students. But ideally, education, and ideally, if we're talking about equal opportunity, ideally, education is not about educating only the people who can test best. It's about taking care of children. It's about benefiting learners. So we would let them go to any school that was in their best interest, even if they didn't test particularly well, because going to that best school would probably help them test better, right? So that then, okay, let's say we grant all of that. And then I just wanted to touch very, very briefly on this issue of, well, there's just all of this kind of rage and hate coming from the left, and these people, they just don't want these children to have equal opportunity. I think it's really important to remember that a lot of the people who were against Ms. DeVos's appointment were educators themselves. It's really hard to put teachers in the position of saying, well, see, those are the limousine liberals, right? They're just so wealthy and they don't want the poor children to have the same. In most cases, teachers are really financially struggling. And I think we know that. And I think that's part of why the unions frustrate us so much. It's because at the end of the day, we dislike the idea of teachers fighting for pay because we think that teachers should be kind of willing to do it for very little pay because it's supposed to be a labor of love. Fair enough. Perhaps in some way, the idea of making teaching about money corrupts it in some sense. I don't know. Again, that ends up being a different conversation that we can have. But to say that teachers are only doing this because their unions are protecting them because they want more money is just simply attacking the motive. And I don't think the evidence is there. These teachers are genuinely concerned that what is happening is not in the best interest of students. And what's funny about it is the one group of people we seem really unwilling to listen to. We'll listen to our politicians, we'll listen to business owners, we'll listen to parents about what should happen in education. But the people who ring the bell saying the standardized testing thing isn't working well. We have these concerns about waivers, right? The children are having these problems because we're only focusing on math and English and not on the whole student. In each one of those cases, we tend to rebuff the teachers and say something along the lines of, well, you're just saying that because you don't like giving tests and your children aren't doing very well. Or you're just saying that because you want the summers off. Or you're just saying that because you want more money, etc., etc. And it's odd because if the medical field stood up and said, you know, this is a problem, this is something we need to worry about in some particular issue, we would probably at least listen to what they had to say. When educators, who often spend more time with our children than their parents do on a daily basis, say, we're seeing it, we're in there, the things that we're doing are bad for them, we ignore them. And instead we attack their motive. But given the fact that most teachers are so poorly paid, I think it's a little bit unfair just to assume that everything that they're doing out of some sort of hate and out of some sort of overwhelming greed. Because most people, at the end of the day, don't become teachers, and they certainly don't stay teachers for the money. That being said, what we really need to start asking ourselves, if we really were going to be fair, is how much we, as a society, are willing to invest in our children. Not just in terms of our time, and not just as parents, because I think, honestly, we can say that we really do love our kids. I don't think anyone can really argue that. But how much are we willing to pay? How much we, as a society, are we willing to pay to meet that idea of equal opportunity? As the fact of the matter is to make sure that every child has that fair chance, that equal chance, as much as a very wealthy child, that costs a lot of money. And for my part, I can't actually think of a better way to spend it. So with that, I leave you. I hope you have a wonderful week.